Hi everyone, this is Zico Callahan here with October of 2020 in Paleontological Review. So without anything further to get into, let's get started. So the first thing we're going to look at is the sale of Stan the T-Rex, which is more of a news item than it is a scientific paper. Stan the T-Rex has been used in some research, but this sale, which went for $32 million, has now put Stan the T-Rex into a private collection rather than a research institute, which causes a lot of problems for how the sciences work. First, other researchers can't go in and verify the information that has been published on the specimen. And second, it does set this kind of precedent that very important specimens like Stan might just end up in more of these private institutions, rather than continuing to be available for researchers to look at. In comparison to Stan, the previous highest selling dinosaur was the fossil of Sue the T-Rex, which sold for just over $8 million in 1997 to the Field Museum. However, even with this much lower price tag than Stan, the Field Museum couldn't afford this alone, instead getting help from different organizations, including McDonald's and Walt Disney. Well, his organization at least, meaning that yes, Sue the T-Rex is technically a Disney princess. Fundamentally, fossils really shouldn't be available for only the super rich, but instead should be accessible by many people so that we can all learn more about the natural history of the Earth. As for published papers, we're going to be starting relatively close to home, for me at least, with the Neutrophanosaur coming from the petrified forest of northern Arizona. Neutrophanosaurs were a very strange clade of reptiles coming from the Triassic period, and while we don't know necessarily a ton about what they were related to, they certainly had a lot of very strange forms, such as Trypanosaurus, which had very weird arms that it used to dig into bark looking for insects and grubs. This new fossil, though, would have been digging into somewhere you would much more expect, and that's the ground. Skybalonyx Raptor is a new genus of Trypanosaur coming from the petrified forest, only described from a few hand claws and a few other bones of the hand. The authors were able to compare these claws to the claws of other modern animals that do a lot of digging, such as aardvarks and anteaters. From this, they were able to try and make sure that they were finding the correct lifestyle for this animal, and these fossils do line up with the modern animals, so it is very likely that Skybalonyx was a digging animal. Additionally, I was able to talk to the lead author of this paper at the Society of Vertebrate Paleontology meeting in October, and he mentioned a few other features that are in the rest of the fossil that do also still suggest this kind of digging lifestyle. And those should be published on in the future, so that should be something that we can all look forward to. As for another group that was getting its start in the Triassic, we can look at the Pterosaurs, like one paper did, although it didn't look at just the Triassic pterosaurs, but rather a wide range of them, specifically trying to understand the micro-wear patterns on the teeth of these pterosaurs to try and understand their diet. Whenever an animal eats something, what it eats will cause small scratches on the teeth. For example, if an animal is eating hard bugs, that will cause a different kind of scratch than something that is much softer. By using this and comparing the teeth of the pterosaurs to modern-day reptiles, the authors were able to find the diets, or at least expected diets, of many of the very early animals and pterosaurs likely weren't quite what we expected. As an example of this, Dimorphodon's mostly been expected to have been a bug eater, and that these early pterosaurs very likely started flying in order to try and catch more bugs. This study suggests that Dimorphodon wasn't doing that at all. Instead, it was more likely eating smaller vertebrates, small lizards, and potentially even very early ancestral mammals. What this suggests is that instead of flying in order to try and catch prey, it's far more likely that the pterosaurs started flying in order to escape from predators or move around their environment easier, rather than doing it as strictly a hunting mechanism. The pterosaurs would diversify rapidly after the Triassic-Jurassic extinction, as would many other clades, such as the Thyrophians, a group of dinosaurs which includes both the stegosaurs and the ankylosaurs. A new paper on some of the very first known and potentially basal members of this clade has shown that Scutellosaurus is indeed the first true Thyrophean. What this shows is that the Thyrophians and the Ornithischians were able to radiate very rapidly after the Triassic-Jurassic extinction, something which we had always thought was the case, but due to limited fossils has been very hard to prove. The fossils used in this study represent at least 40 different individuals of the genus, making Scutellosaurus one of, if not the best documented dinosaur coming from the early Jurassic. Additionally, it also shows parts of the animal that weren't known from earlier described fossils, and helps us to identify a couple of features which can help us identify an animal as Scutellosaurus, even if it's more fragmentary in the future. For example, a series of small depressions are absent along the nasal bones of Scutellosaurus, but are present in other species that are related to it. These kinds of small and minute details are very indicative of how paleontology works, where just very small changes in the bone can help us understand what the true diversity of life was even long ago in the distant past. Other clades of animals started diversifying even further back than the early Jurassic, with some of them starting potentially as far back as the Cambrian. Specifically with arachnids, a new study has suggested that they first diversified in either the late Cambrian or early Ordovician, about 500 million years ago. More important than how they got their start, though, was a look into when they got onto land. What the authors found is that there was likely only one land-moving event in the arachnids, meaning only one ancestor of the arachnids moved to land, and then from there diversified the spiders and the scorpions and the other arachnids. This is different than what has somewhat been previously thought, where it may have been multiple land-going events, meaning that an ancestor of spiders specifically went out onto land, and then a separate ancestor of the scorpions moved onto land. This can help us understand and show just how early the arachnids were able to get onto land. But it also raises a significant question, because most arachnids today, with a very few exceptions, are predators, and if they're going onto land, they were probably trying to hunt something at some point. As for the things that the arachnids may have been hunting, there's new evidence that helps to support the idea that they may have been myriapods, which are today millipedes and centipedes. It's long been shown that these were some of the first groups to move onto land along with the arachnids. However, this fossil coming from the Devonian has specific features that help to suggest this as well. The rock slab the fossil was found in has a lot of evidence of preserved sulfate evaporite minerals, which suggests that the sediments that the animal was found in, either just before or just after the burial, were in a very dry or shallow water environment. This suggests that this is fairly close to where the animal lived, meaning it would have been a dry environment or in shallow water, which does suggest the animal may have been able to leave the water for at least short periods of time if it needed to. The animal itself, called Erisxerces podii, also shows a couple of features which do suggest land living, such as a series of large cavities inside the body, which aren't found in any water-living arthropods today. The trachea, or something resembling trachea, also seem to have slightly different functions and features than the trachea of the centipedes, which should be closely related to this animal. What this suggests is that if these are indeed true trachea used for bringing air into the body, that unlike the arachnids, the myriapods may have actually evolved to go onto land multiple times, with separate events leading to slightly different tracheae, although that will need more research for us to fully understand. However, moving to land also means making tracks, the same way some of the first people to make it to North America did in the White Sands of New Mexico region. Then a few years ago, there was a fossil find of a series of tracks which seemed to indicate humans hunting a giant ground sloth. And while there's not that same kind of interaction with the environment in these tracks, they do show a series of very interesting features. First, the person was walking at least 1.5 kilometers, or a little over a mile. And while that doesn't sound like a lot, it is important to keep in mind the very beginning and very end of this person's journey are cut off. There are also a series of features which suggest that the trip would have been much longer than this. The first being that the return tracks that follow the same pathway are made in slightly drier mud, which does suggest that there would have been more time for evaporation to happen during the day, which would have allowed these secondary set of tracks to be made in that drier mud. Additionally, there's the fact that on the way out, the person was carrying something. A child. In certain places, there are a set of toddler tracks that do follow along with the adult person tracks. However, it's also important to note that at times these disappear, and the person's weight shifts based on what we see in the footprints. This likely means that the toddler was getting tired and needed to be carried. Furthermore, there are some other interactions with some of the animals around. In between the outgoing and return trips, there's a bull mammoth print, which continues straight through and across these prints that were existing beforehand. The bull mammoth didn't really care, but there was another animal that crossed them that certainly did, a ground sloth. From what we know based on the other set of footprints, we can certainly say that humans were a threat to ground sloths. And this ground sloth that crosses these tracks took a long pause there to sniff the air and try and make sure it was under a safe condition in order to continue on its way. The humans, though, don't show any of this kind of pausing behavior at any kind of sign, at least within this part of the trackway. And this is despite there being many predators in the environment, such as saber-toothed cats, American lions, and direwolves. The fact that these two people, the toddler and a young adult, were able to go out all the way across this playa and back confidently shows just how comfortable the first people in the Americas were in their environments, and how confident they were in their own ability to take care of themselves and to address and cause potentially predators to at least second guess trying to attack people. Going back to predators, one of them was the direwolf, which is mostly known from North America, in particular the La Brea tar pits, where there are over 200,000 different specimens of direwolf. However, these are admittedly mostly fragmentary. Now, a new fossil shows the first record of a direwolf anywhere in Asia. A large part of this has been thought that the direwolves mainly dominated southern North America, with northern North America being dominated by gray wolves, and the competition between the two species keeping each other more or less in check as far as migrating north or south. With just this single fossil coming from northeastern part of China, it helps to show that there is potential for direwolves to have made it further north than we had previously thought, and even all the way back across the Bering Land Bridge. However, there are still some issues with this idea. Because the fossil coming from China is so fragmentary, it's hard to completely be confident in its assignment to the direwolf, especially as a lot of the dog species look very, very similar as far as their bone structure goes. And so it's going to take a little bit more of a complete fossil to be at least as confident as we can be, and really should be, for understanding just exactly what was the range of the direwolf. Sometimes, though, fossils show features which are completely unique, and makes it really easy to understand that this is a new genus or species, and that it can be confidently assigned there. For example, the new Overraptorian Oxovo-arvisan is the first known Overraptorian with only 2 fingers on the hands. This is a very, very unique adaptation and hasn't been seen in a lot of other fossils, especially of the Overraptorians, which are generally reconstructed with 3 fingers, like most Maniraptorians. Additionally, it's important to note that when these fossils were found, they were essentially captured from smugglers, meaning the smugglers had found them and were trying to sell them on the black market. Fortunately, even despite this, the authors were able to say that these fossils were all from the same location, based on the sedimentology and the fact that these were all in resting position, meaning that they would have been probably guarding nests, although that's hard to tell for sure. And even if they weren't guarding nests, there were still young animals and juvenile animals found nearby, meaning that there's a good chance that if they weren't nesting in this location where they were resting, they were at least taking their young around and resting where they happened to end up dying, probably due to a sand dune collapse, as this is something that's been found in a lot of different animals that have been found from this time period in the Gobi Desert. There will need to be more work done on these fossils though, especially with the juveniles, which can hopefully help show how the Overraptorians were able to grow and develop throughout their life cycle. Additionally, there's hopefully going to be more study on this 2-fingered kind of dynamic that they had, as it does help to show and emphasize that there was a general reduction of the 3rd digit in Overraptorians throughout the Cretaceous, as this is the most significant loss of that digit, and could hopefully help us understand what were some of the behavioral or advantageous things of this trait, losing the digit. As for other smaller dinosaurs, there was a description of a new type of abelisaurid, which is quickly becoming one of my favorites just because the abelisaurs are really neat, and this one is just so small. Spectrovenator regii is a new genus and species of abelisaur coming from the early Cretaceous of Brazil. Unfortunately for this individual, it was found under the bones of a much larger animal, a titanosaurian sauropod. While it seems very convenient to try and say that these two animals were regularly interacting in their environment because of this, it's really not the case that we can define that. Instead, there's a very good chance that these two animals were washed together in a river or a flood, rather than it being regular interaction between these two animals in the environment. Outside of this preservational issue, though, there is a lot that Spectrovenator tells us about the broader diversity of the abelisaurs. The first abelisaur that we know of, at least by this study, is Eoabelisaurus, coming from the middle to late Jurassic. However, Spectrovenator fills in a huge gap, being the only known abelisaur coming from the early Cretaceous, with all of the other abelisaurs only showing up and radiating outwards during the late Cretaceous. Spectrovenator is also shown to have a much more basal jaw structure, meaning that the unique and very short jaw structure of the abelisaurs probably needed to develop first before they could attain the larger sizes that we see during the late Cretaceous with animals like Carnotaurus. This means that this jaw structure was key for the abelisauurs being able to compete with and try and rival the size of the Carcharodontosaurs, which also existed in South America at the same time, with animals like Mapusaurus and Giganotosaurus. Unfortunately for us, we don't have enough details on that jaw structure and why exactly it evolved to be able to define why exactly this is the case. Only that there's a very good chance that that needed to develop first before the abelisauurs could be as successful as they were during the late Cretaceous. During October, there was another description of another new abelisauur, and this one was also described as small, although it was still quite a bit larger than Spectrovenator, with this one measuring about 4 meters or around 13 feet long. Nibella antiqua is the new genus and species coming from the very, very end Cretaceous of the Patagonia region of Argentina. This is unique for a number of reasons, not just being that it lived very close to the extinction of the dinosaurs, or the non-avian dinosaurs. There's also another species of the abelisauur from the same formation, the Allen Formation, that Nibella was found in. Based on the fossils we have, Quilmosaurus, the other abelisauur coming from the formation, would have been about the same size as Nibella. However, looking at the histology and bone growth of both of these specimens, we can say with some confidence that Nibella was an adult animal, while Quilmosaurus, while being the same size, would have still been a juvenile. This is different than we see in other late Cretaceous formations, such as the Hell Creek Formation, where Tyrannosaurus rex was essentially the only large-bodied predator in the environment, and its younger stages, like the subadult stages, would have filled in all of the medium-sized predator gaps and niches that would have existed in that environment. This means that there's a lot more diversity, and not all of the dinosaurs were doing quite all of the same thing towards the end Cretaceous. There was enough variation that they certainly should have survived, at least some of them, the end mass extinction at the Cretaceous, or at least the deckhand traps, if the meteor hadn't hit. With that extinction in mind, and in South America specifically, another study was done looking at some of the survivors of that extinction, the plants. A few studies have been done looking at South American fossil samples of pollen. Because pollen's fairly resilient and hard-shelled, it can actually survive very well in the fossil record. You just need to get a very good microscope in order to find the little fossils of pollen, rather than just finding a much larger thing like a tree. Because these studies have already been done, the authors of this study did do that separate part, looking for the larger pieces of a tree or leaves. What these two metrics mean together is that even with 45% species loss, the overall families of trees and larger groupings of trees would have survived. So while a species of tree may have gone extinct, the larger family that tree came from would have survived and continued to thrive and been able to diversify after the extinction. Another clade which was fairly successful that made it to the extinction but not past it were the ammonites. And while this paper doesn't necessarily show us why they went extinct, it does look at part of the reason that they may have been so successful, although its findings are fairly inconclusive. Suture patterns in ammonites become increasingly more complex over time. For example, you can look at this one coming from the Jurassic and see that it does appear fairly complex. However, when we compare those same suture lines to the suture lines in this ammonite coming from the Cretaceous, you can see just how much more complex they become. There's been a lot of ideas about why this is the case. Most of it has come from, were they able to better survive at deeper depths because of these more complex sutures? And this study goes to show that this probably isn't the case. The authors were able to use 3D models of the sutures and the shells of the modern nautilus, which is a similar animal to the ammonites, though not directly related to them. These models were able to show that there's not really a significant advantage to having these sutures when it comes to living in deeper and deeper pressures, which makes sense when looking at the living nautilus, as it also generally lives at deep pressures, but it doesn't have these sutures. What this means is that we're effectively back to square one on what exactly these sutures are and what they mean for evolution, as far as an advantage that the animals had. As for complex features in dinosaurs, there were 2 papers that looked at complex features within 2 very, very well-preserved dinosaurs coming from different Lagerstätten. The first coming from Germany, in very similar conditions that preserved Archaeopteryx, and the second coming from the Chinese Jehol biota. Direwolf is a genus of dinosaurs that was found in Germany, coming from the very late Jurassic. What the researchers found is that some of the scales preserved in this fossil are very similar in structure and shape to certain scales in crocodilians. The scales that it's most similar to in crocodilians, though, are sensory scales, meaning that the animal can feel different pressures very sensitively, which helps the animal when it's in the water in order to try and find prey. This is very interesting, as Direwolf is known from a very small juvenile specimen, and it likely didn't do the same amount of swimming that we find in the crocodilians. It did, though, live in an archipelago, meaning it may have waded into the shallows and occasionally hunted for small prey, such as small fish or shrimp. It's really hard to identify that behavior, though, just from the fossil record, but it does show that these kinds of sensory scales may have also gone back to that common ancestor of the crocodilians and of the dinosaurs, meaning that the pterosaurs, who are somewhat in between these two clades, may have also had these types of sensory scales, at least in the early days of their development. The other fossil coming from the Lagerstätten is the famous fossil of a hetakosaurus coming from the G-hole biota. This fossil has already been used to show the kinds of countershading that these fossils would have had, and also was preserved with some feathers, or at least feather-like structures, which was unusual coming from a Ramniskian. Now authors looking at the fossil in greater detail have been able to say that it also preserves a dinosaur butt. Dinosaurs, like the birds and crocodilians, have a cloaca, which is kind of a one-purpose hole for poop, pee, and anything else that it needs. What the fossil does show is a much more crocodilian-like cloaca, rather than a bird-like one. What this means is that the cloaca of birds was something that they specifically evolved and adapted, probably to help them fly, although that's going to take a lot more fossils and more research to try and understand. Plus, it really does come down to how likely we are to find a bird butt in the first place. However, you never know, so always get out there and keep looking for fossils, even if bird butts aren't necessarily what you're looking for. Hi everyone, thanks for watching. I want to give a shout out to the Patreons on Patreon, Steve Black, Madeline Lockyer, Sean, and Erttad. If you join the Patreon, you're able to get some benefits, including voting for my next What the Hell Is This video. The Patreons for this upcoming month of November have chosen to look at Indohyus, a very interesting mammal from the Eocene that we will be getting more into as soon as we get that all filmed before the end of the month. Mentioned at the end of the What the Hell Is This video that it is Diabetes Awareness Month over November, so please try and, if you want to help out there, you can look at Type 1 International. I really recommend them for their outreach that they do. With that in mind, everyone, I want to be sure that you be safe, take care, wear a mask, and don't go extinct.